Hello, General Biology, and welcome to Section 4.3 in our Chapter 4 series. And in this chapter, we're going to talk about succession. So I went too far there. Okay, so in 1883, there was an island of Krakatoa, and that's located in the Indian Ocean, that was actually blown to pieces by an eruption. The island for a long time remained barren. There was nothing growing on the hardened lava. And about 2 years after the explosion, grasses started to grow. And when they came back and looked at it 14 years later, there were about 49 different plant species that existed. Some of them were like little shrubs and trees. And along with that, there were animals that were lizards and birds and bats and insects. So that by 1929, there was a complete forest that contained over 300 plant species. And the island today is a mature rainforest. So we asked the question, how did that happen? And we're going to watch this video in class to be an example of this. But let's talk about how that. In this section, we're going to look at the key concept of how communities change over time. With the background knowledge that we already know that ecosystems do change over time. And they can change after disturbances. And even though we may lose some species that lived in that area, some species, new species, will move in to help that community to thrive. So we're going to be talking about this process, and it's defined as ecological succession. And what this means is that there are kind of like steps or a series of more or less predictable changes that occur within a community over time. And we need to keep in mind that, we could look at a forest and think, oh, nothing's happening in that forest, but the ecosystems are constantly changing within that forest. And they do change, especially after some sort of disturbance, a hurricane, a volcanic activity, extreme weather, flooding. All of those things can cause reason for the ecosystems to change. And we do lose some species. They might move out. They don't necessarily have to die, but they can move out, and new species will come in. So over the course of years, the number of different kinds of species that are present will fluctuate throughout the time, but they typically increase. Well, there's two types of succession that we're going to talk about, primary succession and secondary succession, and you do need to know the difference between the two. So when we think about volcanic explosions, they can either create new land, so islands forming in the sea, and we'll see some videos on that, or they can actually sterilize or totally wipe out existing areas. The lava flow can just cover and burn and kill anything that was existing on the ground before. We can have the same effect with glaciers. We call them retreating glaciers, the glaciers that are melting, and they leave ground that is totally uncovered, that has no plant life at all, no animal life on it at all, and nothing but exposed bare rock because of that movement of the glacier. So what happens is this process of succession. And primary succession happens in an area that have no remnants of any older plant life, animal life communities in there. So that's why it's called primary succession. So as you can see in this picture, we've got bare rock that has been exposed in this area. So what happens is through erosion and wind and stuff carrying dust and seeds, there will be tiny little I want to say a moss. It's not really a moss, but a type of plant that is called a lichen. Lichens, lichens. And you've seen lichens. You've seen lichens growing on the sides of trees and rocks. It's kind of a grayish green, and it grows in like little flat layers. These lichens, they actually grow flat and they're kind of scaly, kind of like fish scales. So that what happens is as the rock erodes and the wind blows, it blows this dust into the lichens. And you can see little patches of lichens here in that picture. And as it gets more and more of this dust and particles in it, it'll wind up dying out, and it'll start to create soil. Areas where grasses can actually start to take form. So this is lichens and then grasses that are taking form on it. And then as the grasses grow and they begin to die out, they start to add to the soil, and wind blows all kinds of seeds. And if it's deep enough, then these little shrubs, and this is not a little shrub, but it's a shrub, starts to take place. And again, as they lose their leaves or as branches fall off, flowers fall off or whatever, they contribute to making soil so that trees can start to come in and grow. So this is succession, and this is how the island that we started talking about in the Indian Ocean started to grow and get the diversity that it had with that. So that's primary succession, and it happens on an area that has been completely stripped of any types of older community members that were there. So an example, as we said, is that your book uses is Glacier Bay, Alaska, with a retreating glacier and exposure to barren rock. It's going to take over the course of 100 or more years for this series of changes to take place. And what it does, it'll at first come into like a spruce and hemlock forest, and then we'll get deciduous trees that will come in later on. And the changes in this community are going to continue for centuries. So you can actually, if you're really familiar with succession and know what to look for, you can actually look at an area and tell whether it is a new growth forest or an old growth forest based on the types of species that are present and growing in that particular area. So it continues to change. So never think that a forested area has stopped growing or stopped changing. There's always going to be change. Even when an older tree falls down, it opens up the canopy. The canopy is actually the leaves at the top of the trees. And when an old tree falls, then it reduces that canopy, that cover, and species that need sunlight now are going to be able to get sunlight, and they're going to start to grow. So a forest is ever changing, and land is ever changing because of this natural succession that has been built in. The first species that colonize an area are called pioneer species, and as I mentioned to you, lichens are a primary pioneer species. Google it. Google lichens. It's spelled Lichens, and take a look at it. I know that you have seen them before on trees and rocks and places if you've ever been in a wooded area. One of the ecological pioneers that I mentioned is a lichen, and they have mutualistic symbiotic relationship that makes it between a fungus and an algae. And that's what develops on these barren areas. So over the time, the lichens will convert or fix atmospheric nitrogen into useful forms for other organisms because they attach to the rock and and to bare spots, they can actually break down the rock, which adds organic material to the soil. They can catch the dust and erosion that is being blown in the wind in their scale-like pieces that they have. Certain grasses also are pioneer species where they will grow, one of the first species to grow, and they usually grow on top of the lichens. The other type of succession is called secondary succession, and this exists in communities that have not been completely destroyed. Last year, there was a horrible, horrible fire that raged through the Smoky Mountains National Park in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, and that's where I went to college in Tennessee, and I was very familiar with Gatlinburg. My parents lived outside of that town, and that's where I would get my summer jobs in the tourist community. I was a puppeteer for a place called the Embraceable Zoo, and I worked in that town, and they had a huge fire, and the fire ripped through that large part of the Smoky Mountains. And because there hadn't been a fire there in about 100 years, there was a lot of twig and leaf debris that had built up over that time. So the fire just ripped right through. It had a lot of fuel to burn, and it really damaged a lot. So now, after that, secondary succession is going to be the next step. I'm sure that not all of the trees were damaged, but a lot of the trees were. So some of them will still grow, and they'll grow back, and they'll grow green. But some of them were killed by the fire, and there's nothing but like a charred twig left. And because that now allows sunlight to come in, we're going to see in the first 3 years after this fire, we're going to see little pioneer species of shrubs starting to grow because the soil's still there. So it'll be a little bit more rapid. And then we'll start to get maybe some cedar seedlings, and we'll get some hemlocks. And then as it gets bigger, those trees that still, like maples and birch and that survived, they'll drop their seeds, and we'll finally see that growing up. So that'll take about 40 years or so. So secondary succession proceeds a little bit faster, and we can get new surviving vegetation that can grow rapidly. So as I said, it usually follows, this kind of succession usually follows a wildfire, a hurricane, a flood if it doesn't wash away the soil. And most of the events that I've described we consider as disasters. So many species are adapted to them. There are forests out in the Southwest and in the western United States that they thrive off of fires. One of the things that they need in order to germinate is high temperatures. So their sap is actually oil-based, so that if a fire happens, it'll burn. And then their seedlings, which need high temperatures in order to be able to germinate, will be able to germinate from those high temperatures. So when we oftentimes think that fire is bad, sometimes there's communities and species that need that fire in order to survive. So secondary succession can also follow human activities like logging and farming. If we leave an area barren for a while, it'll grow back over. All right, we're going to end this screencast here, and we'll come back and we'll talk a little bit more about secondary succession.